93 years old. Well, one of the countries Shimon Peres particularly grew a close working relationship with was China. China's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs went to see Mr. Peres in hospital just last week, demonstrating the significance of the country's bond. Joining me now live from Jerusalem to discuss this further is Sam Chester, an expert in China and Israel relations. Sam, thanks so much for joining us here on the program. Just give us a sense of how significant Mr. Peres was in managing this relationship between Israel and China.
Well, the Chinese, in their official statement, called Shimon Peres the father of strategic relations between Israel and China. So I think we can look at that in two ways, perhaps. One, in a very practical sense, Shimon Peres was there. He was the individual in the 1980s as Prime Minister of Israel that really engineered the forwarding of commercial ties between the two countries. And then, of course, in 1993, after the two countries made official ties, he was the one as foreign minister that led the first trip with himself and the Prime Minister, his colleague Yitzhak Rabin, to China on another trip that forwarded the ties between the two countries. That said, putting just aside the mechanical steps he took, I think more broadly you could say that Shimon Peres' career really reflects the entire history from the 70s until today of Israel-China ties, which we can discuss in more depth.
Indeed, because Shimon Peres was seen as a long-term thinker, visionary that thought in the long term. And in many ways, this is something that China advocates and practices.
Yeah, of course. I would take a step back and say, let's look at 5 elements of Shimon Peres, and those 5 elements really represent Israel-China ties. The first one would be arms deals. Israel and China ties began in the 1970s and continued for 30 decades until the end of the 90s, based upon weapons. And Shimon Peres, of course, is the individual in Israel who is most responsible for building up Israel's flourishing global arms industry, and that was the beginning of China-Israel ties, which Shimon Peres is very responsible for. Number 2, I would say the high-tech industry. Shimon Peres was one of the leading voices of the startup nation over the last 20 years, particularly to China, and of course, high-tech has replaced the arms industry as the glue between China and Israel. Number 3, I would say peace. Of course, Shimon Peres is known globally as an advocate of peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and increasingly China in the last 10-20 years has sought to put itself as a global statesman advocating and forwarding peace between Israel and its neighbors. Number 4, I would say stability. Really, when China pivoted back toward Israel in the last 7 years, it was increasingly because Israel not only was a high-tech power, but also was a stable power amidst the turmoil of the Arab Spring and continuing in the last years with Syria and other countries in the Middle East. Peres, of course, represents stability like no other figure really in Israeli history, both as president and in his previous positions, and the Chinese very much identified with that. And the last thing I would touch on is what you had said, which is vision. Peres, increasingly in the last 10 years of his life, positioned himself globally and within Israel as a pioneer, as a visionary. That is something that the Chinese, who of course tend to look 10, 20, as Zhou Enlai once famously said, 50 years into the future, very much appreciated and connected with the late Shimon Peres.
And Sam, just briefly, we're short on time, but Jiang Ming, China's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, went to see Mr. Peres just last Thursday in hospital.
Yeah, that reflects the personal relationship that Peres has had with Chinese leaders over 30 years. And I think it's a statement from Beijing saying we respect this individual and we respect the ties between these two countries that he helped engineer over his career.
Sam Chester, thanks so much for that analysis and review of Shimon Peres.